This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
"For thou knowest I am hard to turn," was a line from an old Scotch-Irish prayer. With their Bibles, farm tools, and rifles, their potent corn whiskey, their black slaves, they brought from Kentucky a hide-bound loathing for taxes, Roman Catholics, and Eastern ways. Their trust was in the Lord, and common sense. That they and their forebears had survived at all in backwoods Kentucky, or earlier in upland Virginia and the Carolinas, was due primarily to good, hard sense, as they said, and no end of hard work. They were workers and they were loners, fiercely independent, fiercely loyal to their kind. And they were proudly prolific. David Daly, recorded as the first man to break the prairie sod in Jackson County, came west with a wife and 12 sons, while Christopher Mann, who outlived everybody of that generation, had already produced with his Betsy 17 sons and daughters, and with a second marriage fathered 8 more. Years afterward, at age 87, this memorable Jackson County pioneer could claim he had never lost a tooth from decay and could still hold his breath for a minute and a half. They believed in big families. They came from big families. Children were wealth for a farmer, as for a nation. President Tyler himself had 8 children, and in another few years, at age 54, following the death of his first wife, he would remarry and have 7 more children, making a total of 15, a presidential record. Solomon Young, who was one of 11 children, and his wife, Harriet Louisa, one of 13, were from Shelby County, Kentucky, east of Louisville. And so was Nancy Tyler Holmes, a widow with 10 children, who made the journey west to Missouri 3 or 4 years later, about 1845, once her sons had established themselves in Jackson County. Carrying a sack of tea cakes and her late husband's beaver hat in a large leather hat box, she traveled in the company of several slaves and her 2 youngest daughters, one of whom, Mary Jane Holmes, was secretly pining for a young man back in Shelby County named Anderson Truman. He was one of 12 children. If Solomon and Harriet Louisa Young were acquainted with any of the Holmes or Truman families by this time, there is no record of it. Nearly everyone made the expedition the same way, traveling the wilderness not by wagon or horseback, but by steamboat. The route was down the winding Ohio River from Louisville, past Henderson and Paducah, to the confluence of the Mississippi at Cairo, then up the Mississippi to St. Louis. Changing boats at St. Louis, they headed west on the Missouri, the Big Muddy, fighting the current for 457 miles, as far as the river's sudden dramatic bend. There they went ashore, at either of 2 miserable, mud-bound little river settlements, Wayne City or Westport, which put them within a few miles of independence, still the only town of consequence on the frontier. With the terrible current against them, the trip on the Missouri took a week. The shallow-draft boats were loaded so deep the water broke over the gunwales. Wagons and freight jammed the deck, cordwood for the engines, mules, horses, piles of saddles and harness, leaving passengers little room. One side-wheel steamer of the era that sank in the river and was only recovered more than a century later carried cargo that included everything from axe handles and rifles to school slates, doorknobs, whale oil lanterns, beeswax candles, 2,500 boots and shoes, and thousands of bright-colored beads and buttons intended for the Indian trade. Day after day, the heavy, shadowed forest passed slowly by, broken only now and then by an open meadow or tiny settlement where a few lone figures stood waving from among the tree stumps. Some trees towering over the river banks measured 6 feet through. On summer mornings, the early